Welcome to the Myint-U. We're very happy to have you here. And I would like to shoot the first question. As the NLD-led government comes into power in March and April, I would like you to share your perspective, your optimism. Do you feel that, the reform will take more meaningful step? And what are the challenges and opportunities facing the country and for the government that will come into power?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I think in general, I'm very optimistic. We all know the challenges. The transition to democracy is at best half finished. Right. There's no agreement on constitutional change. We have major economic challenges, issues from land to electricity to other things related to the growth of the economy. We have very weak institutions. On the other hand, I think what unites almost everyone in this country, 99% of the people in this country, is that there is a desperate desire to catch up with the rest of the region. And I can feel from everyone, from very top to ordinary people, that they don't want to remain the poorest country in the region. They want to see growth, they want to see economic change, and they want to see it in some kind of freer country, and if possible, more democratic country. So I think that energy is what's going to animate a lot of what comes next. So I think also because what we need to do is not rocket science. In terms of developing the economy, it's what many countries have done over the past 50, 100 years, since England in the 19th century, to Europe, to Japan, to Korea, to Taiwan, to all these places. We know more or less what the prescription is. And we've seen so many other successful transitions to democracy as well. So I think it's not rocket science in terms of what's necessary. I think if you look at the details, there are huge challenges and huge problems. So I think if you take a step back and look at the next 10, 15 years, I think there's a lot of reason for optimism.
Thank you, Myint-U. Before we talking about the prescription, I would like to hear your opinion on this process, reform process, because there has been renewed interest in Myanmar or Burma, and among donors and investors. But how can the country, the Myanmar, maintain its momentum, and as well as to attract a new foreign investment and donors, and also as well as to increase its international engagement and image, because there are a lot going on in the international area. And if you look at Middle East, if you look at the Africa, if you look at even in the South China Sea conflict, and I think they are concerned about how Myanmar can resurface, how can Myanmar attract the international interest. It's touch and go sometimes. How can we take advantage of this renewed interest in Myanmar?
I think that even if not much more happened in terms of economic reform and everything else, I think we will still see growth, because we're moving from a situation of really bad policies to not so bad policies. And usually when that happens, you see explosive growth. It's just because people suddenly have some electricity, people have a solar panel, people have a motorbike, people have some stability. They can do 5 times, 10 times more than they could before. So I think just that momentum alone will help improve the livelihoods of a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people. I think the question is whether we move from that kind of growth, 5%, 6%, or can we really have the explosive growth of countries like Korea in the 1980s of 10, 15%? That will require strategic government policies. And the problem for us is we don't really have the institutions that can easily manage those policies. Now, assuming that we still have political stability, assuming that we have at least this level of political openness, freedom of political debate, assuming that we move even incrementally towards more democracy, then I think most of the challenges are related to the economy. And again, the question is whether we see 5, 6% growth that's good for most but not for all, or we really see that 10, 15% growth that's going to bring the poorest of the country also up into a much better life in 10 or 15 years' time.
So, talking about the NLD and economic policy is still very much vague and early stage, people said that. But also we're talking about expectations. It is very difficult once the government comes into power, how to manage expectations. There are a lot of news articles talking about high expectation. But I think, as a Burmese and with a Buddhist background, Burmese have a very modest expectation. That may be a good thing for the new government. But I think in the business level, and the international investors and donors, I think they will have a very high expectation.
I think you're exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes the problem is people here are too patient.
Right.
I think people are too patient, and I think people will continue to be quite patient. I think
so too.
I think to some extent amongst the top people on different sides of the political establishment,
Right.
there is some degree of, we have all the issues right now about the immediate transition and the government and things, but in general, there's a sense of what the way forward is. It's not like you have royalists on one side and communists on the other, and it's not that kind of huge ideological divisions that we've experienced in this country as well in the past. But I think in terms of international interest, I mean, we live right now in an almost 0% interest world. There are trillions of dollars out there looking for a place to invest. Myanmar needs hundreds of billions of dollars to invest in infrastructure. It needs tens of billions of dollars, literally, in foreign investment for the infrastructure it needs for the economy to take off. It has a unique opportunity now to try to attract the investment it needs. But again, for those things, it needs the institutions that are going to come up with the policies. I think the top leadership, whether this government or the NLD government, will have the right instinct, but turning that instinct into real policies will require technocratic and institutional help. And we don't really have, or only slowly redeveloping some of those institutions.
I'm quite sure that the NLD leadership has seen the McKinsey report that said that the country needs billions of dollars of investment in infrastructures and in an area of manufacturing. And when you talk about institutions, we have very, very weak institutions. The question is, how can international community and donors and investors help assist, encourage a kind of, to build a stronger institution in the country?
It has to be demand-driven, not supply-driven. Mm-hmm. It's the responsibility of a democratic government to have the policies, have the programs, and compel the donors to have their aid fit with that strategy and with that program. It's not for the donors to decide.
But you don't want Burma to be aid-driven.
It shouldn't be aid-driven. I think
it should be like in Cambodia.
Yeah, aid is going to be and should only be a very small part of the picture. Right. The main thing is how to attract the private investment, and then what is that donor assistance that might be required in the short or medium term that can complement that assistance. So for example, if you have an area where you know that to create jobs, you need this kind of investment, whether it's in tourism sector or manufacturing or something else. Right. You know that the government should spend more on health and education. But in the short term, you need donors to assist in whether it's a highway upgrade, whether it's help on education or something else, but it has to fit within an overall vision that's going to have private investment and local investment at the center of that vision. I think in terms of institutions, you go back to the last democratic period in the 1950s, it was very messy politics, very messy politics. But in the 1950s, we had a Burma civil service, we had a foreign office, we had a Rangoon University, we had a central bank, we had institutions that were some of the best in the region. We don't have any of those institutions now. So if we go back to messy politics, we don't have that cushion of good institutions on which to rely going forward.
Well, one of the issues is also the NLD was saying, Aung San Suu Kyi herself said that a couple of weeks ago, the peace is the biggest issues that her government would tackle and were trying to resolve the issues. Do you think they are setting a very high, ambitious look at the peace, conflict issue? Because the peace, when we talk about peace, that is also related to the business and extractive industries and the neighboring countries that are very influenced on domestic politics in Burma and ethnic conflicts. How do you see, because you as a president advisor to the current administrations, you were very much involved peace building process. How do you see it? How should the new government tackle the issue?
I mean, on every issue, I think it's wrong to have an economic prescription that doesn't first look at the reality of the political economy here. Who is making money? How? Right. Unless you have that analysis first, it's impossible to think about how the economy can change. What I mean is you can't have people coming in from outside, coming up with ideas of what's worked outside without thinking of how the current system works, however corrupt or in other ways, that has to be the basis for thinking about how things can change. UNU said in 1949, we'll have peace within 1 year.
Right.
So I think there's always been a hope, an expectation that we will have peace very soon. And I think it's a noble expectation, and I think it's a good focus. But I think we have to be clear that peace means different things. I mean, one is peace and reconciliation between the different peoples of the country, linguistically, religiously, ethnically defined.
Mm-hmm.
If we move towards a more federal system of government, more local democracy, more equality, less discrimination, a lot of those issues can be, I think, slowly resolved. A more inclusive civil service, for example, more inclusive institutions in general. That's slightly different from the question of how to deal with the armed groups, many of whom want those things, but many of whom will also have other aims and ambitions at a personal level or institutional in terms of economic interests, in terms of revenues and everything else. Right? I think there'll be many armed groups who feel that they are legitimately fighting for the self-determination of their people or for non-discrimination and other things. But we all know that in different parts of the country where you've had a war for 70 years, you also have an entrenched political economy on which all sides benefit, often in illegal or corrupt ways. So how is that? I think it's not a generational change, but it's not going to be solved in a few years' time. And I think we need much more homework and much more detailed sort of accounting of what is the situation now before we can even start to think about what is a strategy for moving towards a different phase. What I don't want to see, and I think what people who live in those conflict areas don't want to see, is the kind of thing that we saw in many of the ceasefire areas in the past, where you have a ceasefire and then you have carpetbaggers coming in from the outside, you have elite deals that are very secret, you have some people at the top benefiting, but the people on the ground often don't benefit at all or even worse off. And I think this missing piece of what is going to be the economics of peace building over the next 5-10 years is going to be crucial.
It's going to be a very long way to go, I think. But also at the same time, I think how do we see, because of the president thing saying, took the credit of building the peace and national reconciliation and signing the NCA, but it's a critics said that it's a half-baked success. So I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi-led government will carry the torch, I believed, and I don't think they want to reset this whole issue. They will continue to proceed, but I think the approach will be very much different.
Yeah, and I think that because there have been so many discussions, because there is this NCA framework, which is a very broad framework. Right. I mean, you can read many different things into it. You can take it down very different paths. I think there's going to be a lot of both the kind of homework that I mentioned, but also I think we need a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. We don't need the kind of peace deal that would have worked in 1949. We need a kind of peace deal that's going to work in 2020 or 2030. And I think that, if you just take one issue, I mean, we're going to be a much more urbanized society. If we have the kind of economic growth that everyone wants, by 2030, we will have 10 million more people living in cities than today. If we have most people living in Myint-U or Lhasa or Mandalay, or not in the countryside there, armed conflict or the potential means something very different. But also ethnic harmony, ethnic relations also mean something very different. I think, just again as one example, how to build more inclusive cities where everyone can feel at home is going to be as big a challenge as issues about, say, local autonomy, because most people won't be living in villages or remote villages anymore. So I think we need a lot more out-of-the-box thinking in terms of how to have a peaceful, inclusive Burma or Myanmar in 10 years' time.
It's a beautiful word, peaceful, inclusive Burma or Myanmar. But at the same time, if you look at the past and the history of our country, particularly those in the north, never been governed. So I think our governing is very important. You talk about the federalism, federal union, and the hill people are still very resentful towards this Burmanizations and the army controls and playing a very dominant role. And it's going to be a very long way. It's not just, it cannot be driven by the business and the economy alone.
No.
It has to be looked at it from the very much local perspective and
and I think
I
think at the national level, the issues I mentioned of inclusivity, of non-discrimination, of equality. Right. At the local level, there has to be some degree of local democracy. I mean, people have to feel that they are governing themselves, or at least that people from another part of the country aren't coming in and governing them. There are issues of state building, building basic state
Exactly.
capacity where there hasn't been state capacity ever, even in British times. But then there's an additional aspect, which is that we are near much more populous countries. We are next to countries like China, which are much more densely populated, at least in parts, which are economically much more dynamic. I mean, in a way, one could argue, why not have the most liberal approach? You know, why not give everyone autonomy? Why not give maximum autonomy and let people govern themselves all the way down to the village level? And I think that makes a lot of sense up to a point. But then when you factor in the fact that we are still a relatively small country, where what defines what is being Burmese or Myanmar is partly that we are not of India or China, then it becomes a much more complicated calculation to think about. And I don't think there's an answer. I think it has to be a work in progress. And I think the important thing is to think about what can meaningfully be achieved in 5 years. And I think at least no violence is one thing. I mean, that alone benefits a lot of people who have been subject to violence and displacement over many decades. I mean, basic development that is inclusive, that's not exploitative, that's actually going to benefit millions of people in conflict-affected areas. Building some local institutions of self-government. I think we have to set some. I'm not against a peace conference, I'm not against a peace deal, but I think we also have to think about what's realistically possible over just a 5-year period as well.
Thank you. Myint-U, you mentioned that China, and you're also an author of one of the best-selling books, Where China Meets India and Burma and New Cross of Asia. And talking about China is a heavy subject. I think we have a little time now, but we're going to touch on a very heavy subject. Burma is a land bridge to India, and also China has a strategic interest in Burma. At the same time, there's a new player, which is the United States of America. And China is not going to go away. And Aung San Suu Kyi, when she was released in 2011, and she was saying that we cannot dislocate our country from to anywhere, which is she's last year we saw her. She's been invited to Beijing met the Chinese presidents, and so I think China is making a new approach to Burma. And recently, you wrote in a Financial Times about how Burma should reset its policy, rebalance with China. How do you see NLD-led government? In any case, Aung San Suu Kyi will be the one who will be calling the shots in terms of foreign policies.
I think with China, I mean, first of all, it's very good that sanctions have virtually been lifted, that there is the potential to rebalance relations, that relations with the West are getting better, relations with Japan are growing deeper. And I think there's absolutely no reason why this country cannot be friends with everyone.
Right.
And I think everyone agrees generally that we should be friends with everyone. China is a very special case because over the last 20 years, China has had a track record that people will judge. China has been involved in projects that have been very unpopular. People in this country have
among the Burmese?
Amongst the Burmese, yeah. And many people have a view of China that is often very negative. And so, that's a very different case than with any other country. At the same time, I mean, we are next to the greatest industrial revolution in human history. China is an enormous engine, or has been, for global economic growth. Right. China has the tens of billions of dollars that can be invested for the kind of infrastructure investment that this country, Burma, desperately needs. The question is, how can we fit these two stories together? How can we attract and have the kind of Chinese investment that will actually be good for this country? And that means not simply responding to Chinese requests, whether it's a dam project or a deep sea port. It's for the Burmese side to think through, what does it want? You know, does it want one deep sea port, two? Where should it be? Does it want railway lines improved? Where should it run? And then to ask the Chinese, as well as the Japanese, as well as the Americans and everyone else, to invest within a framework that the Burmese people themselves decide democratically in an informed way. So I think it's about bringing the Chinese in, wanting to bring the Chinese in, not being too defensive about China, but bringing it into a framework that the Burmese people themselves have decided under a democratic government.
I personally want a first-grade Chinese investment in our country. But at the same time, I think the new government, a lot of people are saying that should have a review of the the existing Chinese projects?
I think there's a little bit of a balance. I mean, this is true on everything. On the one hand, I think there's a need for an urgent review. I think any review should be urgent. It shouldn't be a 3-year review or 5-year review. I think if we're going to review major projects, it should be done very, very quickly. Because I think you also don't want to dampen investor enthusiasm at a time when you really need investments from everywhere to come in as fast as possible. So there's a little bit of a calculation or a balance that needs to be struck. But in general, I don't think any project should be seen as sacrosanct, that simply because it's been signed or agreed, it cannot be touched, especially a big one that might have a huge impact. But I think the first thing over the first 3 months, 6 months, 9 months going forward is going to be to think about China policy, where China's relationship to the armed conflict, the potential for Chinese investment, current Chinese projects, China's strategic interests, all of these things have to be looked at together. We can't look at them apart. All of these things have to be looked at together, and I think that strategic discussion with China can lead to a win-win for both countries. If you think of China's bottom line, they don't want a country that's dominated by others. They want...
You mean Japanese and US?
Or US or anyone. They don't want Burma jumping into another military camp. They want to see this country as a potential land bridge or crossroads for them in terms of access to the Indian Ocean and to other countries like India, for example. Both those things shouldn't be a problem, right? So if you take it up to the strategic level, I think there are ways in which both countries can find a solution. If you go down to the details, should we restart MISO or not? It's a lose-lose. It's a lose-lose. So I think we have to take it out from those individual projects and have that strategic discussion.
But when we talk about China and other players that is more prominently engaging in Burma since the opening in 2012, particularly Japan and the US. I think the conventional wisdom among Burma watchers is that China is unhappy. China is unhappy with the US coming in, the Western influence. Do you agree with that notion?
Not completely. I mean, I think because we've been so isolated, we're so used to no competition over Myanmar. We see a little bit of competition, then we think we overestimate it sometimes. I don't have a sense that in Washington or in Tokyo or Beijing, they want this to be a point of conflict. There are many other more serious issues strategically. Sure. I think we need to make the case how Burma can be the place of cooperation between all of these countries. And I think they all know, and they all want a peaceful,
we don't want this
country
to be better ground for the
No, and I don't think they do either. No. And I think we need to be a little bit careful. Right. I don't think that that's what any of these big countries are thinking or wanting. And so I think for Myanmar, the biggest challenge of all, we think about democracy, we think about the economy, we think about peace process. The number one challenge is de-isolation. Right. If you think about this country, it's been isolated 40, 50 years on its own, then under sanctions. Coming out of this isolation brings so many different challenges. Right. If we go back into the global world, global economy, global society, with the kind of narrow nationalisms that have developed in this country over 60, 70 years, we will not succeed.
Well, when you talk about de-isolation, this is the area I want to discuss. In spite of we have very little time left, that's de-isolation, and which is how Burma looks itself and its place in the world. Between China and India, with a more aggressive, more settled engagement coming from the West. If Burma or Myanmar fails to acknowledge its prominence, its strategic locations, and its potentials, I think there's also danger that Burma will fail. With best case, it will waste.
Our number one asset is our geographic location.
That's right.
Between ASEAN, China, India, the biggest markets that are growing in the world. But also, I think it's not just that we're a country between China and India. Mm-hmm. Now we have millions of Burmese living in Thailand. We also have hundreds of thousands of Burmese, millions of Burmese who have relatives in Australia, UK, America, all these places for the first time ever. I mean, the Burmese are becoming, without knowing it, globalized again in a certain way. And I think we have to have a very imaginative take on where we want to be in the world and the kinds of relationships we want. And again, we have to use that to get rid of this very narrow nationalism and build a kind of nationalism that everyone in the country can feel part of.
So talking about foreign policy, and then if I see you as a foreign minister of this country, how do you want to take this country into the next place?
Well, I won't be foreign minister of
Well,
this
that's
country,
my question.
but I think in terms of foreign policy, it's about moving a little bit away from the old non-aligned approach, which is a little bit defensive, at least since the 1960s, and towards a much more proactive foreign policy, where it's about having good relationships with everyone, but maybe different. I mean, our relationship with Japan can be very different than the relationship with China or the relationship with America. I think this country, Burma, should be much more involved on international issues like climate change, for example, which is going to deeply affect this country more than almost any other country. So I think on discussions about climate change, international peace and security, health risks like the spread of infectious diseases, we should raise our profile on all of these things. That will also give us a depth and a weight which will allow us also to engage with other big countries better, I think, as well.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.